Outside the Box is a seminar series where we plan to thematically approach the sort of interdisciplinary nature of CO2 storage. And the name is, of course, referring to the fact that we need to think outside the box in order to really deal with the challenges and the barriers to full-scale deployment of CCS. Because, of course, it's important not to have just an understanding of the geological aspects, which Anja presented for those of you who are here, but also the wide range of economical and political and technological and legal and social aspects and how we all link them together. So we're very, very happy to have you all here and to welcome you all here. And above all, we're very happy to have our 4 invited speakers here, and we're very excited to hear what they have to share with us today. Thank you so much for coming.
Yes, so we have 4 speakers today from the Department of Oil and Energy, from Cicero, and from Gasnova, and from Bellona. The topic of the day is basically political and economical feasibility of CO2 storage in Norway. How are we going to meet the climate mitigation targets that we are obliged through the EU agreements to achieve within 2030? Each lecture will be about 20 minutes long. We will keep the talks kind of continuous and then open for discussion afterwards. And for those who stay until the end, so in 80 minutes from now, there will be coffee and cake for your enjoyment and keep up the blood sugar. Our first speaker is Asbjørn Torvanger. He works at Cicero. He holds a PhD in economics and knows how we can make this economically viable. He deals with cost of leakage, governance, and energy-friendly measures. I'm very excited to welcome you here.
Thank you for the invitation. So, I would like to take the global perspective on the issue of carbon capture and storage, and then go through that onto what are the main challenges of moving forward on carbon capture and storage. I will from now on call it CCS. That's carbon capture and storage, and I will also explain this concept to you. And finally ending up with what I believe are the most important steps moving forward with CCS. So I take the global perspective because CCS only makes sense because we want to limit emissions of greenhouse gases. Climate change induced by human interactions, or more specifically, emissions of greenhouse gases, and then foremost, carbon dioxide. So I will start with the main points of my talk, 3 of those. I will argue that it's very hard to avoid CCS if we want to meet the climate target from the Paris Agreement. We are also now in a situation where there is severe underinvestment in CCS. We only started in terms of deploying this technology, both in Norway and globally. And in terms of the major bottleneck moving forward with carbon capture and storage, in my mind, that is creating the demand. We heard from Anja that we know pretty much about the geology. We also have developed a lot and learned a lot about technologies to capture and also transport CCS, but it doesn't help. There will be no deployment if there's no demand in society for this. So that is the major bottleneck, and that is both from engaging the industry, as you can see, but also across countries, because it also does not help if only Norway is willing to do this. It won't make a much impact on global emissions. So let me then start first with the concept, for those that have not heard so much about carbon capture and storage. So if we have, and I will then do the example of a gas or coal-fired power station up here. We use coal for the energy here, or we might have a gas field where we pipe gas to the power station. So this fuel is combusted, and as you all know, that will generate carbon dioxide, CO2, and we use a technology to capture this CO2. I will not go into those technologies. There is a wide array of technologies, but the is so-called post-combustion based on the chemical amine. So you capture there, you condense the CO2, and you transport it in a pipeline or in a in a ship, and then you inject it into a suitable geological formation. And as Anja explained here, it could be actually the biggest resource here is saline aquifers, which is sandstone filled with seawater, but it could also be depleted oil and gas fields. So that is the major concept of carbon capture and storage. So next, well, why do we need this then? Well, I refer to the Paris Agreement. Probably you all know that the world in this agreement adopted a target, which is to limit warming to 2 degrees by end of this century. And they even said that we should pursue 1.5 degrees, which is much, much harder, obviously. And then you need to compare that to where the world is moving now, and that is to a warming of 3 degrees Celsius by end of this century, maybe more. Of course, we know that renewables, wind, solar, etc., will take us in the right direction when this is replacing fossil energy. We also know that more efficiency in production, consumption, traveling and transports will help. Same for more efficient use of energy, less emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. But we also know that that will not be sufficient, neither for the 2 degrees or the 1.5. So let me now refer mostly to the 2-degree target. Because there is a large share of emissions from not only from power station, but also from industry. And we will not be able to reduce those emissions fast enough without carbon capture and storage. There are also 3 more, let's say, dimensions to this I would like to mention, because Norway has a lot of resources or reserves of natural gas. It's possible then to split natural gas into hydrogen that can be used, for instance, for transportation, ships, buses, etc. And that will produce quite pure carbon dioxide. So if you then add a CCS component on that, you can also capture and store this CO2. Second one is something I will come back to, namely the concept of negative emissions. Have any of you heard about negative emissions? Please raise your hand, those who have. Well, about half of you. Okay. I will explain a bit further in a moment. Basically, that is referring to the need to take CO2 from the atmosphere and put it somewhere else as a supplement to reducing our emissions of CO2. And the important thing here in the context of carbon capture storage is that there are 2 technologies in terms of negative emissions that are dependent on carbon capture and storage. And often that is forgotten. And these are the bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage, and what is referred to as direct air capture, which I often call artificial trees. And then a third one, which is actually that's come more and more into focus now, that is the CCUS, which refers to carbon capture, use, and storage. One of the major options there is enhanced oil recovery, where you inject CO2 into an oil reservoir at the end of the life of this reservoir to produce more oil. In my mind, I need to add then, in my mind, I think this is a kind of dubious. I'm not sure if this actually is a good climate technology. It's a good resource technology in terms of extracting oil. Other ideas for using the CO2 instead of inject it into, for instance, the geological formation is to produce synthetic fuels, certain chemicals and plastics. But there are two major issues with that, all these alternatives more or less, and that is really, well, it might have some potential, but does it really matter? How big is the potential in terms of what we need? And I will come back on that shortly. And the other one is permanency. Okay, you can put the CO2 into chemicals and plastics, take plastics, but if you then combust the plastic article in 10 years' time, the CO2 will be emitted back into the atmosphere. So, being more specific now, these are a set of scenarios in terms of how much CO2 we need to capture through CCS, or handle through CCS, from, as you can see, the time axis until end of this century. And then also note this is the scale, gigatons of CO2. But just to give a reference, top of this axis is about the same as the global emissions currently of carbon dioxide. So if you then look at, well, I talked about 2 degrees, then we are on, these are a number of scenarios, of course, dependent on economic growth, what energy sources are we using, technological developments, etc. So there are a lot of different assumptions run through different models, and you get a whole set of, let's say, potential futures or future developments. But the ones we should look at here are the blue and the green ones. And of course, there is a very wide selection, or is a wide spread of these scenarios. But what is common is that all of these, actually most of these, not all, but most, maybe more than 90%, start with CCS deployment between 2020 and 2030. And as you can see, there's a generally a very fast deployment rates of carbon capture and storage facilities. And if you then compare that to where we are today, from this map from Global CCS Institute, showing that there are presently about 30 facilities globally. But note this is not only facilities in operation, but also planned ones. And we can see Snøhvit and Sleipner, the 2 Norwegian ones, where CO2 is separated from gas to make the gas commercially attractive. And another observation is that most of these are industry, actually. They're not power sector, but industry facilities. So, John, briefly, what is then the situation in Norway? That was the global picture. What is the situation in Norway? Well, we have actually done a lot of research on CO2, specifically capture technologies, for, I would say, like maybe 15 years, and also some on storage and transportation. Anja told a lot about geology and storage in the lecture before this. We have the Sleipner case from 1996 and the Snøhvit from 2008, which are both are gas separation, as I mentioned. We also know that we have this failed moon landing at Mongstad, but we have a test center at Mongstad where different capture technologies are tested. We also have 2 pilots of CCS, one in Brevik, Norcem, Heidelberg, which is on cement, and we have Klemetsrud here in Oslo, which is on waste incineration. And the idea is that one or maybe both of these should be developed into full-scale operations. And the CO2 transported by ship and stored under the North Sea bed. But the situation also then that in Norway we only have a few really large point sources of CO2. There are some from petroleum, as I just mentioned 2 here, and there are also some industry plants and waste incineration, as I mentioned, from Klemetsrud. And I believe that the biggest business potential for Norway is in CO2 storage under the continental shelf of Norway. I also then should mention the Northern Lights, which is a collaboration between Equinor, Shell, and Total, and with support from Gasnova, where the idea is to develop a full-scale CCS system in Northern Europe and storage under the Norwegian shelf, as depicted then in this graphic here. Sorry. in this graphic here, we have the capture, we have the ship transportation to a facility in Western Norway, and then the gas is piped and stored in a geological formation at the continental shelf of Norway. And also note that this is not only, the idea is not only then to have Norwegian sources here, but also import or receive CO2 from the continent. It could be from Germany, it could be from the UK. Okay, I mentioned negative emissions, and I also need to make a few words, more words about that, because there are different technologies to do negative emissions. Forestation is a very simple one. You can also fix CO2 in minerals, like olivine. But the two which are mostly important or related to CCS is the combining combustion of biofuels or bioenergy, or biomass rather. And instead of letting the CO2 back in the atmosphere, you capture the CO2. And then rest is the same CS chain as we have talked about earlier. And also direct air capture, where we actually have machines that capture the CO2, like through photosynthesis in a sense. So these negative emissions are also then needed. And to illustrate what I mean by this is a figure from the 1.5 degree report that came out last autumn. And the important message here, and I should mention this is for the 1.5 degree scenario, which is very difficult, as I mentioned. But basically, you have the same picture if I had shown you the one for 2 degrees. And if one wanted, but then you have even less time to do this. You have to move even faster. So the gray area here, this is where we are in terms of emissions globally, and the gray area shows how much we need to reduce, or how fast we need to reduce emissions of CO2. As you can see, this is very fast at this end. So in this case, we don't need negative emissions. And the negative emissions is the yellow field here. And then, if you move to the right, the slower we are to reduce emissions of CO2, the more negative emissions we need to do. So in the sense, if we don't do that job fast enough, we have to compensate by taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And for 2 of those technologies, CCS is essential. That's the point I want you to have. And this is one of the very few facilities that exist today in Decatur in the US. But this is then based on fermentation of corn. So it's ethanol. But still, the CO2 is stored in a sandstone at this location. And there are a few more, but very, very few globally. So why is there so little deployment of CCS? Well, it's expensive. I've given you a range of cost here. This can be discussed, of course, because we don't have so much experience on what the real cost is. And it's also an issue how fast can those costs go down if we really learn how to do this better. And then you can compare that to the price of the European emissions trading, which is about 23 euros a ton presently. And we see that there's a huge gap there. It costs much more than the value. So this means that the industry lacks incentives to engage. And presently is dependent on a lot of public support. And also, you know, this is also, of course, an issue of what do you believe about the Norway's and other countries' ability to do the 2 degree and 1.5 maybe? How sincere are they? How strict climate policies are they willing to try to implement? Because that is very important for increasing the value of CCS. Some believe that there are other carbon-free technologies that can do this. I disagree with that. I think that, of course, we need a lot of that, but it's not sufficient. Some think that other technologies are better. This is blind alley, and as you probably have also heard, there are some countries and there are some groups that are skeptical for reasons cited there. They think that this will prolong the fossil era. We should rather do solar, wind, etc. instead. It's too expensive, and not the least, it's also uncertain, because there might be leakages. And I've heard about the Like NIAS from 1968. So, let me end up then with the way forward. And as I said, I think that the creating or facilitating the demand from society and to engage the industry, and also in Norway and other countries, is really the critical point here. It's not the geology. It's not, understanding of geology. It's not, I would also say, a regulation. Okay, something needs to be further developed, but that is not really the core issue. It's incentives. And obviously, as you understand from what I've been telling, it would be very nice to have a sufficiently high CO2 price in terms of CCS, because that could suffice if it's high enough. It could be a much higher CO2 tax, or it could be a higher allowance price in the European market, emissions trading market. But how likely is that, or how fast will that come? Again, that depends on how much Norway and other countries are willing to do in terms of strict climate policies in order to meet the target of the Paris Agreement. So there are alternatives here. For instance, could the Norwegian government guarantee a price, sufficiently high price, on handling CO2 through CCS for all those that are, or all companies that are willing to do that? We have a lot of public procurement services, investments, buildings, infrastructure in Norway. We could require that either this should be based or linked to CCS, or at least there should be low carbon products and services. For instance, in terms of low carbon cement. Or CO2 from cement production should be captured and handled through CCS. You could also have a regulation saying that no new facilities will be allowed unless there is a CCS requirement. Or there could be a deposit refund system for CO2 emitted. All the different ideas. And this has to be done in collaboration with other countries. That's why I like the concept of dugnad. It's a Norwegian concept, but it's you do what you are able to do in order to fulfill a common target. That's important. For instance, then around the North Sea basin. So we have to share the development, the deployment cost with other countries in Northern Europe, for instance. And in that regard, I think Northern Lights is a very good example of the kind of perspectives we need. So let me end up with this one. Since there is a fair chance that we also need negative emissions, I think that is an additional argument for developing CCS, because we need that for at least two of these technologies, not the least bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage. We also need more social science research on this, because CCS, as all technologies, needs to fit into a societal context. It's not only about engineering. Why do I say this? Because I have actually gone through all the research money from Norway used on CCS, and more than 99% has been used on technology-related research, and some on geology. But a huge amount of this money has gone to foremost capture technologies, and also then some to transportation. But we need business models. I gave you some ideas here. We need business models also for storage of CO2, which could actually become a big business for Norway in the future. We need to design efficient government support schemes for CCS, because this is also not straightforward. There is a balance on giving incentives, but also kind of what is the, let's say, proper risk sharing. Because if you take on storing, let's say, German CO2, and there is a risk of some problem in the future, which we cannot say is not non-zero. There could be a risk. There is a liability involved. It could be additional costs in the future. How do we handle that? How do you know what kind of contracts should Norway have with Germany in that case? And we also need to have collaboration with local communities regarding storage sites. Of course, as long as you are in the Norwegian shelf, it's not, as you pointed out, it's not a big issue. But if in the future it should be required to do storage on land, this would also be an issue, because there actually have been some pilots where this has been suggested, and there was a strong in Germany and Netherlands, and there was a strong local community protests against that. So at the end of the day, what we need is feasible and realistic strategies to deploy CCS, which research says that we need for the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will introduce our second speaker for the afternoon. And it is Mr. Egil Meisingset. He is the Deputy Director General at the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy. His background is in economics, which he has here at the University of Oslo. Has actually worked at the ministry since 1986. And as of 2011, he heads the ministry's CCS section. So please welcome to the stage.
Thank you. Pardon my English, so I have a manuscript here. Thank you for the nice introduction. And not only heading the CCS section. Yes, we have a CCS section in the ministry. My and the section's main task is the Norwegian full-scale project. And hopefully through this presentation I will demonstrate why this is an important project to demonstrate that we can do CCS. It's a couple of years since I left the university with my degree in economics. So I'm trying to drop some economic terms in the manuscript in case some of my professors has not retired yet. And frankly, this is the most interesting and exhausting task I've ever had. And I can promise you it's great fun. But also a big responsibility. As I hear, the Norwegian full-scale CCS project is regarded as a catalyst for development of CCS in Europe by many, as it is now. So we have to succeed. But fortunately, we see a growing interest for CCS in Europe. For example, today, my minister, he is in the Storting answering 6 questions regarding CCS. 6 questions, that's never happened before. I have a long and winding title of my presentation, Realizing Full-Scale CO2 Capture and Storage in Norway, Accelerating CCS in Europe. And this title points right at the central challenge in our efforts to make CCS happen in Norway. How can a Norwegian project contribute to the development of CCS in Europe? But why should the government be involved in this? From an economist's point of view, it is all about externalities. Climate is a common good. It's low priced, it's overused. Some call it the tragedy of the commons. Economists call it negative externalities. And research, development, demonstration is a common good. It has positive externalities. And then we have economics of scale in transport and especially in storage. All this is relevant for how we shall interfere with this project. So state intervention can be justified to a certain extent. In the long run, if we shall succeed with CCS, CCS must happen without state aid. Therefore, we need business models for CCS. Support models is only as a start. The short version of our message is the planning of the full-scale project is on track. We have a good fundament for further work. But to succeed, this project must be relevant outside Norway, and the project must give business development. These two are, of course, closely interlinked, and I will say this several times in different words. And as I said, my focus is on my focus is fixed on the investment decision. How can the cabinet and the Norwegian Parliament get the best basis for decision? Including, as a civil servant, loyal civil servant, also an opportunity to escape. But hopefully, we will present an irresistible project. So, this picture is, I have not credited to Mr. W. Eugene Smith, who took it in 1946. Some of you know it as by its name, A Walk to Paradise Garden. And this demonstrates that I'm willing to use every trick to get my message through. I assume this picture will melt the heart of any climate skeptic, of which I think there are very few in this audience. So let us continue. That's why CCS, and I will not repeat Asbjørn more than necessary. He gave a brilliant introduction to that theme. So studies from IPCC, IEA, others show that CC is a necessary climate mitigation tool. Even if all energy production takes place with no hydrocarbons involved, we will need CCS in a variety of industrial processes where there are no alternatives. But also in energy production, CCS is relevant. Hydrogen made from natural gas with CCS, so-called blue hydrogen, is one example. We need that too. We can discuss how much CCS we will need, but CCS has to be in the toolbox. So, why Norway? I think Asbjørn covered that too. More than 20 years of experience from Sleipner and Snøhvit, demonstrating that CCS is doable and safe, and that economic incentives work. We have huge storage capacity under the seabed. We have, as a rich country, obligations under the Paris Agreement to contribute to developing low emission technologies. And it is good for industry and employment, for existing industry, and for new industry development. That is quite important if we shall get a political support for spending that much money. Why now? Because the Norwegian CCS project can make a difference for the international development of CCS. And we all know that we must start now if CCS shall grow to become a significant climate mitigation tool in time. So, sorry. Okay, I lost the picture, sorry for that. The picture I lost is a picture of a nice family picture of the Solberg government. You all know have been in power for more than 5 years. And the ambition on CCS has been there from the start. And since January this year, the Solberg government has also been a majority government, as you know. And it is almost unanimously support for CCS in Norway, including all political parties, industry and labor organizations, and NGOs. I think the only acceptance is Greenpeace. Anja showed a nice picture earlier today about how they work in Germany and other places to, say no more. And we get from the other NGOs, we get constructive input. So they, NGOs like Bellona and Zero, they are very constructive, at least on CCS. This does not mean that Norway will spend more than €1 million on a Norwegian CCS project without conditions. I will come back to that. Until 2013, the Mongstad full-scale project was the main asset in the Norwegian CCS efforts. There is much to say about why we didn't succeed with that project. But it clearly demonstrated that you cannot urge the industry to do CCS through conditions in their emission permit. But we also learned much from the Mongstad experience, which is relevant for the new CCS commitment. For example, the project now takes advantage of underground studies from the Johansen Formation after the storage site was moved westwards last year. After the discontinuation of the Mongstad full-scale project, the government published a new CCS strategy in the 2015 budget. The strategy includes research and demonstration, which includes research centers, research programs, of which climate is the most important, and international research cooperation, including EU programs. It includes demonstration, where TCM, the Technology Center Mongstad, is vital. We see an increased interest in testing at TCM. And we are now working on a prolongation of the agreement for TCM for the second time. Then I will continue with the full-scale project. First saying that the different parts of this strategy are closely interlinked. For example, the full-scale project will induce new research and demonstration at TCM. And in the next presentation, Kari-Lise Rørvik from Gasnova will give you more about this. We have the project aims, which you see is listed here, to demonstrate the full chain, to establish infrastructure, to demonstrate safe and efficient operation, provide cost and risk reduction for subsequent projects, technology dissemination, and industrial development. Quite a load. The establishment of infrastructure with excess capacity and low marginal costs is vital for establishing business. This must become an attractive option for capture projects in Europe. And here we have a beautiful alignment between the governments and the industry's incentives. The government needs proof that the Norwegian project is relevant, and the companies involved need to make profit. This is a good basis for working in the same direction. Because I have to underline this, because relevance for Europe is a prerequisite for succeeding with the project. Commercial utilization of the storage capacity from European companies will demonstrate relevance. And we have to set up a support scheme for the industry involved in the Norwegian project in a way that gives the industrial partners the incentives to make this happen. So, very quick through the map here, which illustrates the Norwegian full-scale project. We have the capture from industrial sources. We have transport of CO2 with ship to an onshore terminal. And we have a pipeline to offshore storage under the seabed. We touched upon the Snøhvit development in the former presentation. And you will notice that this looks very much like the setup on the Snøhvit. So, and also note that we have a nice bunch of international companies participating in the project, including Fortum, Heidelberg Cement, Equinor, Shell, and Total. This is important for many reasons, including ability to execute the project and ability to spread the experience and build business. Late in 2018, the transport and storage part of the project went through the so-called DG2, including a cost update, meaning that all parts of the project, capture, transport, and storage, are now in the feed phase. That is front-end and engineering design phase. That's the last study phase before the investment decision. So we are coming closer to that. And I must say that the cost estimates, they survived that update. That's a good thing. And in January 2019, Equinor was awarded an exploitation permit, which they need to drill the combined exploration and injection well. And let it be no doubt, the industrial partners and Gasnova are doing a great job with the planning of the project. Will rush through the cost estimates, but as you see, the total cost is between 1.1 and 1.2 billion euros, including for one capture site, for transport, for storage, and 5 years of operation. We have not decided if we shall have 0, 1, or 2 capture sites. Just to say that. And here we have the timeline as it in a concentrated way. There is also a really engineering diagram with hundreds of activities that are linked together and moving this. And as it is now, we think that it is possible to have an investment decision late next year in 2020, if everything moves right. But what we have communicated in the budget, it's 2020/2021. Yeah, this also includes a quality assurance process, which is also a very comprehensive task, just to make sure that we are that we have the right quality to the parliament. So, just a little bit about barriers. Why isn't CCS more widespread if it is so obvious that we need it? I have given some indication, so has Asbjørn, that there are some barriers still. First, political. One thing, it is challenging in the political system to prioritize with such long lead times that it is with CCS. Both Norway and EU have mixed experience with CCS project not being realized in the past. A new unsuccessful experience with CCS project not being realized will be a major setback for CCS as a concept. Therefore, some of the politicians in Norway and in Europe are somewhat reluctant so far. And there is resistance, or at least serious skepticism, against CCS and storage in particular in some countries, most notably probably Germany, for good and bad reasons. But we see a positive tendency. The IPCC points at CCS, including bio-CCS and industries, and CCS on industries with no other alternative. The commercial barriers, we have touched upon them. There are high costs for the first projects. Sharing costs between the state and the companies involved is necessary for the first projects. It's challenging to establish a balanced financing model and later a business model without state support. ETS quota price / CO2 cost is important, but then we also have the issue of, we also have the issue of so-called carbon leakage. If the cost is too high, then the industry move out and then we sit there. On the regulatory side, the EU has its CCS directive. When we saw that the first time, we thought it was impossible to cope with it. We see that this is possible. We also have which includes the regulation of responsibilities for leakage. One of the objectives with the project is to get experience from applying regulatory framework. This also applies to the application of the London Protocol to allow for transboundary transfer of CO2 for storage. On the technological side, this is of course a technologically advanced and complicated project, but we must not overspeak how advanced this is. We have done large-scale underground storage in Norway for more than 20 years. Same goes for shipping. Capture is also proven technology. The challenge is to introduce capture in existing industry and to organize the different parts of the chain. The Norwegian full-scale CCS project shall demonstrate that this is possible with different commercial entities, a flexible transport solution and storage with significant economics of scale. So these barriers, we can handle them. Are there any barriers left then? The remaining challenges, which are, of course, the results from FEED, including quality, cost, and risks, must be acceptable. And the second one is the crucial one. Expected learning versus learning effect versus resources spent. Will the Norwegian CCS project make a significant contribution to international use of CCS? I said this 7 times now, but still, this is the crucial question, and how we shall demonstrate this. Political acceptance and support. As said earlier, the Norwegian political support is there, but the broader acceptance of CCS as a climate mitigation tool and political support to the Norwegian project is very helpful. This goes, of course, in the Norwegian context, but also the support and financial aid from the EU system is vital for this project. They must help us to demonstrate that this is relevant. And we see a growing acceptance for that they must be more active towards the Norwegian project. And sharing of cost and risk. The Norwegian state needs to reduce its cost and risks with the project. Even the Norwegian state has budget constraints. But even more important, willingness to take on exposure is a proof that the project is relevant to others. We need that proof. Also, the EU financing instruments is important. And that has to do with the design and the timing of support schemes. For instance, the Innovations Fund for those who are deep into the details here. And then we have the London Protocol. We still have a time-pressing challenge with the lack of acceptance of the amendment to the protocol from 2009, allowing for transboundary CO2 transfer for storage. We are therefore looking into possible interim solutions in cooperation with the IMO Secretariat, the International Maritime Organization, whilst awaiting further acceptance of the 2009 amendment. I think we are in a good process here. Last page. The Norwegian government has an ambition to realize a full-scale demonstration project that makes crucial difference to maturing CCS into commercial use. That commitment is contingent on a conviction that the Norwegian project will work as a catalyst for other European projects. Even a successful final study delivering on specification, time, and cost will not make the cut for final investment unless the government believes this will be the first of many rather than the last of a few. to paraphrase our Prime Minister. We need to establish a much stronger pull for CCS. Currently, there is a lot of push by us, Norwegian government, by Equinor, Total, Shell, and others. However, this push must be complemented by an equally powerful pull by industries that have no other alternative than CCS to survive in a low-emission society, and by European governments that frankly have no realistic alternative if they really are committed to delivering on Paris targets while preserving European competitiveness and jobs. Thank you.
Tusen takk, Egil. Okay. The next speaker is Kari Lise Rørvik. She works in Gasnova. She is a geologist, as well as quite a few of us today here. She holds a PhD in geology from Tromsø and has worked many years in the industry, in the oil industry and the consultant business in reservoir characterization and other interesting subjects. But now she is a senior advisor and will tell us how Gasnova is working towards realizing this full-scale CCS in Norway.
Hello? Yes. Good. Well, thank you, Anja. I was a bit afraid when I came in here that students are getting too old. Not to offend you, but people are quite concerned about climate change. Maybe not your age group. You are getting too old, maybe. But at least people in this age group. I think that's it's a big movement now, and I hope this tiny little group here is not representative of the university students. Maybe it's just bad publication of the event, I don't know. But anyway, I started at the university in 1996. I was sitting in this hallway right there at a table standing there. It took me about 2 months before I realized why everybody was walking in the corridors, that there were actually rooms there to go studying. So I was quite slow starting as a student, but it ended up quite okay. Because if you are curious and you have engagement, you will find even the study room at the VB building. So before Christmas, I made this little graphic here. I put together CO2, temperature, and my family. Do I have a pointer here? Yeah. So if you start here, looking at the CO2 curve over the last 650,000 years, this is how it has changed over the last 650,000 years. And right now, we're up here. Looking at my family, looking at my husband, he was born in '69. I have a quite old husband. I'm born in '77. I'm not that old. You can see something start happening, and my kids are born up here. My first kid was born in 2004, and the third one was in 2010, and we are here today. Okay, so if you talk to a climate non-believer in human activities, he would say, well, it's quite normal that we have fluctuation. Of course it is, but this is quite a bit from normal situation compared to the last 650,000 years. And you can also look at how temperature has changed. My grandfather, he was really, really old, and he's dead, of course, now, but he was born in 1901, and my third kid was up here. Of course, this could be natural, but again, is it? I decided not to send this as a Christmas card to my family because I thought it would be quite depressing for those who would understand it. So I sent a nice picture instead of us smiling and pretending everything was okay. Okay. So there are 3 very important steps to reach the climate goals. Energy efficiency, renewable energy, and this carbon capture and storage that you have heard about today. So we are not in a competition with each other. This is supposed to be done together. I put up this Padlet. So if you are still young, you can try to go into this site. You just type padlet.com, KLR, and you can post to me questions you have. So this I will take as a sign how young you are. I do wonder if you have questions, if you do wonder something about CCS, it would be nice if you would go in there and just leave a comment. Maybe you think this is quite stupid, or you think this is a brilliant idea and you want to tell all your friends. So let's talk, and we can talk there. Or you can do the old-fashioned way and send me an email. That's also okay. So I'm Kari-Lise. Gasnova's role in CCS, that was the topic I got from Anja, which is quite hard to make very interesting. I mean, come on, we are a state agency. It's not like, yay! It's very interesting to hear about the state agency, but what we do is quite interesting. So I will try to make that point. As a lot of people have said, Norway has a lot of experience. We have 23 years of experience injecting CO2 into the Sleipner field. We also have done injection up at Snøhvit, has been in operation since 2008. So these 2 sites, pure storage sites, makes us believe that we have the experience needed to do this in a full-scale CCS project. We also have this test center at Mongstad, which is right off the coast of Bergen. And the planned project, the full-scale project talked about here today, is right outside Bergen as well. As Anja probably has told you today, I was delayed today because of the train. I was sitting on the train and it was delayed for 1 hour, so I have no idea what you have said. But she has probably talked about the storage potential on the Norwegian shelf. We have a lot of storage potential. That has been mapped for several years. And we have now these 3 very nice atlases pointing out different areas where we have huge potential. Of course, there are always going to be difficulties and problems going into certain areas, but that can be solved. And since I'm a geologist, I took the opportunity to talk a little bit about geology. So the area, if you remember what we said, so this was the full-scale project site. Down here is Sleipner, and now, so this was the full-scale project site. This has now been given to the Northern Light as a license. This is the first license of storage. Bergen is here. Anybody from Bergen here? Yay? No. Yay? One from Elin. Here. You're here. So everything is going to happen in this area. If you look at this nice colors here, this is the Troll field. The gas of Troll is here, and the oil and gas is up here. If you are able to take this map view and cut off this is the Troll field here. You see the well bores at the Troll right here. And we are looking into this area. south and southwest of Troll. This is now named Aurora because, as you know, Northern Light is the project name. Northern Light's name in Latin is Aurora. So, Aurora is the area. Johansen Formation is the formation we are going to store in. And if you're not a geologist, you might wonder how is that possible. If you have listened to Anja, that's probably been explained. But you inject CO2 into this Johansen Formation. And if you can look at this nice figure here, this is how it works. So the water depth in this area is about 1 Eiffel Tower, 300 meters. And we are going all the way down here to about 2,000 meters, 3,000 meters. So this is the concept. And how is it possible to get CO2 into a sandstone? Well, this little nice figure shows that CO2 is actually, it managed to flow through a sandstone. So a nice colleague in Australia, he set up this with a soda stream experiment. It's very easy. Just flush it through the sandstone and it's possible. Of course, what is important is that something hold it. So on the top you have to have a nice shale. Everything is taken care of, it's there. Anja has seen it, I've seen it, everyone has seen it. It's safe. So to my talk, the Gasnova state enterprise. We are supposed to advise the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy. We are to manage the state's full-scale CCS project and to contribute to technology development and knowledge sharing. This is done through TCM, the climate program, and the full-scale. So now you have heard about the TCM center, the technology center at Mongstad. So this is actually the world's largest CO2 capture test facility. It's owned by Gasnova, by Equinor, Shell, and Total, and has now been recognized as a global competence center. So if any of you are very interested in capture and not only in storage, just send us an email and we'll tell you more about this. It has been a continuous operation since 2012, and it's an area for training, problem solving, and development. We have very good connection with other countries. So for instance, US has been there several times, different companies and different programs have been there. Okay, so I was talking about TCM, and now it's the CLIMIT. CLIMIT is the national program for research development, piloting and demonstration of CO2 capture, transport, and storage. CLIMIT is organized in such a way that Forskningsrådet, the Research Council of Norway, are responsible for this part of the value chain, the research development part. They have annual calls, while CLIMIT Demo has open calls and is organized by Gasnova. And we are in this part, development demonstration. And there is a hope and increase, of course, from no industry involvement here at the basic research, and up to a very good impact by industry, or that the industry are a partner in the projects, which is very important that the end users also see the value of what is going on in those projects. We have an annual budget of 180 million kroners, and this joint secretary and program board between Forskningsrådet and Gasnova is very valuable. We bring in different views and different opinions, but we work good and well together. An example from the portfolio of CO2 capture. I always mumble and rumble through this because it's not my field, but I'll try to explain as good as I can. So CLIMIT supports many different capture technologies, like post, pre, and oxy-combustion. Look into process and system development and analysis, environmental aspects, and industrial CCS focus. So this portfolio is wide and good, and is continuously evolving and developing. Portfolio of CO2 storage is, of course, for me more easy to explain since I'm a geologist, but we see that in our portfolio we have these elements of subjects. Environment, what will happen if CO2 would leak into the sea bed or into the sea column? Are we able to monitor in the water column? And we have several research programs looking into this. Monitoring more into the what is going on in the stratigraphic column here. Are we able to monitor it? Can we see if something happened in the reservoir? Can we see if something happened, if something suddenly is escaping? And the answer is yes, we can. And we can also monitor it in the sea. We have also project looking into the seal. How can we be certain that the seal is not leaking? We must be certain. We must say to our owners, the Department of Energy, that yes, we are certain, and the Northern Light project are certain. But of course, we need to have, as in a house, fire detectors in case, just in case. Not because we think it's going to burn. Okay. We also need to know what happened in the sandstone, how the plume of CO2 will move around. And this is a lot of projects looking into this, the behavior in the reservoir. We also find it's very valuable to have international cooperation. ACT is one of a good example of how different countries can act together, accelerating CCS technologies. So now it's 11 countries cooperating. The first call was in 2016, and there are good budgets here. And the first outcomes of the projects started up in 2016 are now showing. We had a new call in 2018, and we are in a pre-screen phase, evaluating projects coming in. So all these countries act together, and this is an international initiative to establish CO2 capture, utilization and storage as a tool to combat global warming. Okay, so we have gone through now TCM and CLIMIT, and then it was the third thing I was going to talk about. That was the full-scale project and Gasnova's role in this. So Gasnova, being the state enterprise, working for the Department of Energy, we are supposed to lead the overall project to provide state subsidies and manage the study contracts. It's important to have somebody who can integrate and optimize the whole chain, from capture to transportation to storage. And this is Gasnova's role. So we are in the interface between industrial companies. And of course, people who have been in interfaces know that it's quite challenging, because somebody wants that and somebody wants this. But that's our role, to be this organization who can deal with this. So we also evaluate the industrial project after completed FEED and coordinate work on benefit realization. And of course, we report to the government. So the value, Egil was already mentioning it, the value of the Norwegian full-scale project, first of all, to demonstrate CCS. So with this project, we mean we can demonstrate that we can capture at one site, transport it, and store it. So we know that we can store it from in Sleipner and Snøhvit, but we haven't had the whole chain from capturing from land and transport it out there. We are going to this project are going to contribute to cost reduction for coming CCS projects, enable business development, and of course, mitigate climate change. Have I time for a little movie? Yes? 3 minutes movie? Are you ready? It's in Norwegian, so but I'm sure you can, if there's sound here. Let's try. Just want to. We skipped the movie. Okay. So the point of the movie was to show where does CO2 come from. For instance, this was from Brevik, from the Norwegian plant. How do they manage to emit so much CO2? Well, it's the process of taking this stone and make it into make it. Oh, sorry. Make it. Okay, the time is up. To make it into cement. So what we know is that if we have this one plant of capture, which emits 55 tons per hour, this means that this plant can actually capture 400,000 tons per year, which is comparable to 180,000 cars per year. So now you see there is an effect here comparable to cars. And if you have 2 capture plants, this of course means 360,000 cars. When I show this to high school kids, they're very eager. They're like, why don't you do that? Oh my God, my mom won't have to sell the car, and I can be driven to football practice. And I think this has to be shown to people, that we can actually make a huge contribution by capturing from sites like this. So this is the setup of this full-scale project. Oslo Fortum Varme is your waste-to-energy plant here in Oslo. It's located here. Norwegian Brevik is down where Gasnova has the main office, close to Porsgrunn. So these 2 sites are planned to capture about 400,000 tons per year from both of them, using amine technology, and this includes CO2 cleaning, liquefaction, and buffer storage. So you can have it on the docks here for 4 days. And then the boat will come, pick it up, and it's about 700-kilometer distance, and it will be 1 or 2 ships, depending on how many capture sites there will be. And it will be transported in a liquefied state at 15 bar and minus 26 degrees. It will go up all the way up to here. So Bergen was right here, right? And here on this nice little island, that has to be plowed down. I'm sorry, but this is going to be a very nice terminal. And then there will be a pipeline going out to this Aurora site and into Johansen. Very easy, right? Very nice project. And of course, as Egil said, very, very important that also Europe look at this as a possibility for their CO2 storage. I have said for some years now that everybody can capture, but not everybody can store. We have actually a huge potential to be a site for CO2 from Europe. The Norwegian state gives subsidies to the industry. Each company shall develop their project according to their own procedures and methods. So what I'm listing up here is the framework for this full-scale project. And each of the companies will own and operate their facilities, and the industry must contribute actively to benefit realization. I wonder why people don't go and talk about CCS all the time, because I think this is such a good idea and such a good answer how we can reduce the CO2. It's so basically as putting it back. We borrow the CO2 from oil and gas and from cement and from everything that emits. We borrow it for a certain time and then we put it back. I think she is now my new influencer, and I hope you all know who she is. And if you don't, you can ask me, you can send me a note. But let this be said, there are solutions and we should all talk about it a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. We have come to our last speaker of the day. When he has finished, I'll invite you all to grab some coffee, and I've ordered mini cupcakes. They're beautiful, so I hope you can feast on that. And then when we're done, we're actually going to invite all our speakers up on stage and open the floor if there are any questions. So while you're mingling and grabbing coffee, we can kind of start doing that. Anyway, so to our last speaker of the day, his name is Olav Øye. He's a senior advisor on CCS working for Bellona. And he's responsible really for coordinating Bellona's work on carbon capture and storage. He's got a master's degree in European Union studies, so we have a wide variety of background on our speakers today. From the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and he's also worked as an advisor in consultancy before. He's got a background as a journalist, and also been active in working with the Norwegian and European student movement over the years. So, Olav, I give the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I will, since I am the last speaker, I will try to be brief. Of course, it's okay if you think about coffee and cupcakes to motivate yourselves to hang on for another 20 minutes. But I'll try not to repeat too much of what was said already by the other speakers, because it's some of the things many of the things in CCS are obviously interlinked. But I think for just to explain my background and my NGO for those who don't know us, the Bellona Foundation is an environmental NGO founded in 1986, mainly or most well known as a sort of a campaigning platform against pollution, and in particular against illegal dumping of toxic waste in the sea, in fjords, in rivers. So from that, the Bellona Foundation has evolved from becoming more of a call it advocacy lobby, even lobby organization. But also today we work quite closely with industry in order to create solutions on complex problems, environmental and climate problems. And obviously the climate challenge is arguably the biggest of these challenges. We have been working not only to protest, but also been engaging constructively, as I think Egil from the oil ministry would say, with creating solutions. So we imported the first electric car to Norway in 1989, together with the pop group a-ha. Of course, it's almost 30 years ago now, and a couple of years ago came the latest of the Teslas, well before the Model 3. That's the Model X. And last year we saw that half of all cars sold in Norway were electric, and it's set to rise even more this year. This is very good, but I think it's also a very stark reminder that it's taken us 30 years since we imported the first electric car to Norway to get half of it, and that's not the entire fleet of cars in Norway. It's just the sales of new cars. Of course, the problem is we don't have time. We don't have 30 years to implement carbon capture and storage. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, global warming is likely to reach 1.5 degrees warming. It could happen already within the next 15 years. And I think that's the sense of urgency among industry, among politicians, even among NGOs. It's not really. It's far from good enough. So the Bologna work on carbon capture and storage has been. We have been active on this since the 1990s. As you can see, we've written lots of reports. I'm not going to dwell too much on many of them, but I would like to, if you want to know a bit more about the interlinkages between employment, jobs, the technology of carbon capture and storage, and also why it is absolutely necessary for many manufacturing and process industries. I recommend this report that we published in November last year, which is written by Bologna Europa, our EU, our Brussels office, which explains the interlinkages between CCS, jobs, industry, and also describes some of the ways forward for industry, but also for countries. What should they do in the next couple of years? Just take one example. I mean, the composition of jobs, employment, and industry varies from country to country. But I'll take the European Union as an example of why carbon capture and storage is necessary. As you can see here, this is the distribution of greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 emissions in different sectors. You can see it's about 30% in power production, about 13% in buildings, 20% in transport, 6% in shipping and aviation, 12% in agriculture, and about 19% in industry. Of course, as you know, with electrification, with more use of hydrogen, with energy efficiency, some of these emissions, or most of them, will hopefully be eliminated within the next couple of decades. The thing is, so this is what it might look like in 2050 if these developments that we want to continue with electrification, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. But there will still be a large share left for agriculture, maybe also for aviation and heavy shipping, even though solutions there are also underway. But industry is going to be left as the biggest emitter unless we develop capture, transport, and storage of our carbon dioxide right away. Just to explain, I'm not going to go into. I don't have time to go into the details of different sectors, and I don't know. Can you read this? The guys and the people in the back can read. Just to take cement as one example that we're also explaining in this report that I mentioned. It's available on the bologna.org website. In the cement production, which is one of the biggest emitters on the planet, we're talking about 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, approximately. I mean, the estimates vary, but that's just the process emissions. On top of that comes the use of energy. So the majority of the emissions do not come from the combustion of fossil fuels, even though that's a big part. Most of it comes from the calcination of limestone, which emits CO2, and then cement is produced. And this problem cannot be solved with renewable or with renewable electricity or with renewable energy alone. Steel is another sector which will have very big problems decarbonizing without carbon capture and storage. There are some other technologies as well underway, including a project in Sweden which aims to replace coke and coal in the steel production with hydrogen. Of course, the big if it's going to work, and in any case, that project, that plant will not be up and running before maybe 2040. By that time, we might already have reached 1.5 degrees global warming. So while we are waiting, or if we want to wait for improved technology, we need to implement what we have today. And CO2 capture and storage is the technology that we have today that can decarbonize the steel sector. Similar story for chemicals. So what we are saying, and this I think is similar to what Asbjørn Torvanger from Cicero touched upon as well. We don't need to remove all the jobs, or we don't want to remove all the jobs in these industry sectors, but we do want to remove the emissions, the emissions, and that should be the main point. This figure is not from Norway. This figure is in Germany, where you can see there's almost 1 million employees in the chemicals, plastic, pharmaceuticals, and rubber companies. About 240,000 in minerals, about 265,000 in basic metals such as steel. So shutting down this industry is not an option at all. And here you might not be able to read all the our writing, but it just shows the effects on some sectors, on jobs in other sectors, such as cement and steel, which is used for construction and for electric engineering. For example, constructing windmills. You can also say constructing railways. You will need steel and cement. Steel is also used in mechanical engineering to construct for construction equipment, construction machines, and it's used in the car industry, which then again has lots of sub-suppliers. So these very energy intensive and very CO2 intensive industry sectors have lots of jobs that are in one way today dependent on industries that are emitting lots of CO2. Could mention others as well. Silicon production, which we have quite a lot of in Norway, which is necessary to produce solar panels. Pulp and paper, in particular in Sweden and Finland, these are major industries. And final example, waste to energy, which we have one example here in Norway in this Klemetsrud waste incinerator, where waste is turned into electricity and heat. Just a bit about moving from Norway to Europe. It's absolutely correct what Egil Meising said from the Oil and Energy Ministry said earlier. There is a consensus in Norway that CO2 capture and storage is necessary. This is an example of an op-ed article, opinion piece that was published in one of the Norwegian newspapers last year, with leaders from not only from environmental NGOs but from industry, from the National Associations for Industry and Trade, trade unions, and also the Norwegian Oil and Gas Association, because as has been mentioned before, Norway has a great potential to become a CO2 hub or a CO2 storage for Europe if we make these investments now. And that's also a way of using not only the skills of offshore in the offshore sectors of engineers who are today working on oil and gas, to use the skills of those, but also reuse the infrastructure such as pipelines and platforms in the North Sea. This is a small overview of storage sites in the black dots, potential storage sites in Europe. It's not only Norway. Other countries have that potential too. But Norway has by far the biggest potential to store European CO2. And then there's some ongoing projects, but also some potential projects that we have mentioned. For example, in Sweden, there are some very interesting developments because the Swedes have not only said that they want to have a target of net zero emissions of greenhouse gases in 2045. They've also started engaging in discussions with Norway about how to transport and store Swedish CO2. So this is very encouraging. Of course, there have been been discussions, as was mentioned before as well by Egil. Some issues with acceptance of carbon capture and storage, and I think this has largely been linked to some fears of safety with storage. Of course, if you choose to store the CO2 in Norway, which is perfectly possible, safe, far away from the European continent, you will not have this problem of not in my backyard, which has been a part of the discussion in CO2 capture and storage in Europe. And we also see that organizations, NGOs, such as WWF Germany, have come out in favor. Sorry if I didn't have time to translate this quote, but they are asking for the German government to make strategic decisions on carbon capture and storage, and on infrastructure for carbon capture and storage. We are also seeing that it's not only industry, not only national governments, but also cities that are increasingly looking to mitigate and to reduce their carbon footprint. And here it's not only the sources of CO2, such as the Klemetsrud plant, which is a small photo here you can see, which burns Oslo's waste and thereby emits CO2. But cities can also play a large role in reducing CO2 emissions in the materials that they use. For example, in cement, for example, from this cement plant in Brevik in Telemark, which has been mentioned already. Cities can ask for reduced greenhouse gas emission footprint from the materials they buy. This could be chemicals, could be steel, could be concrete or cement, which is the most important ingredient in concrete. The photo is of the governing mayor of Oslo, Raymond Johansen, who has been a very vocal advocate for carbon capture and storage. And it is very important that politicians come forward and say this. In Norway, it's not that controversial. In other cities, it is a bit controversial still. But again, this is changing, and it is changing because people, scientists, industry, and politicians are starting to do the math, and they are figuring out that if they're going to reach zero emissions of CO2, and not only decrease of 20, 30, 40, 50%, they will need carbon capture and storage. I also mentioned Sweden. This is they're also not only looking at how they can become greenhouse gas neutral in 2045, but also as part of it, how they can remove carbon from the atmosphere. Asbjørn Torvanger mentioned these technologies already. And this MP, Miljøpartiet, the Green Party, which have stated that they would like to see carbon capture and storage for their waste incinerator in Sweden. So things and debate is changing. It's definitely changing in Northern Europe and in parts of the rest of Europe as well. The European Commission has proposed a strategy for the European Union to become to have net zero emission of greenhouse gases in the year 2050. And as a central part of their vision, their plan, they are having carbon capture and storage for industry. Not particularly for coal plants or for gas plants, which they assume there will be a lot less of. But even if you remove all the coal plants, all gas plants, you will still have substantial emissions from industry unless you do carbon capture and storage. So what is it going to cost? I think Asbjørn mentioned one range from 70 to 100 euros per ton of removed CO2. This is just an example from estimates for the cement sector for different types of technologies. As you can see, see if this pointer works. You can see here this is called a reference normal cement plant today. Cost of clinker, which is what cement plants produce. Then you can see the price might double or more if you have carbon capture and storage. One of the interesting aspects here, and this is also why the role of cities as public procurers, as buyers of building materials, is so important, is that even though the price of cement might be 50% higher, it might double. But according to some estimates, the price of a building it might increase only by a few percent if you apply carbon capture and storage. And I think this is important, that even though CO2 capture and storage might seem expensive, if you install it at one particular plant, the cost of the products that we buy in the end will not increase by that much. And the price of CO2 has been mentioned. Today it's a bit more than 20 euros per ton of CO2 in the EU emissions trading system. And this is of course too low. And within the next couple of years, it is not going to be so high that it is going to be equivalent to the cost of capturing, transporting and storing CO2. Regarding financing and funding, which Asbjørn talked briefly about, the EU has some financing program that can fund CCS. One of them in research is of course the Horizon Europe, which many of you will be aware of. Egil also mentioned the Innovation Fund, which is meant to fund demonstration of big full-scale projects. Can be either capture, transport, or storage of CO2. And then also for infrastructure, there's something called the Connecting Europe Facility, which is an EU program that funds common European infrastructure. And I think the Norwegian full-scale project is a very good case for that, because it's beneficial not only for Norway, but it can be used by all of the industry in Europe, since it will be accessible by boat, and as long as the source of CO2 from cement, steel, chemicals, waste incineration, or other, if it's close to a port or close to a river, it can be shipped to be stored in Norway. So just a conclusion, which is maybe not, in one way, not very uplifting, because we don't have the luxury of time. We are in a hurry. But I think most people who look at the industries that I have been talking about would agree that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to manage without cement, steel, and silicon, and many chemicals, which are needed to actually have renewable electricity, needed to build railways, to build wind turbines, and last not least, we can preserve these industries in a low carbon economy if we decide to capture, transport, and store the emissions, and that's perfectly feasible. And of course, politically, it's a lot easier to do this than to shut them down. And I think this is also the question, and much of our message to politicians, to industry, but also to many of the in the environmental movement who are skeptical towards carbon capture and storage. It is: do you want this industry to continue to emit, or do you want, and thereby breaching climate targets and allowing for global warming of 1.5, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, or 4 or 5 degrees? Or do you want to apply CCS? To solve the problem now that it's possible? I think that's the choice that people have to make. Do you want to CCS, or do you want to shut down the industry, or do you want to give up climate targets? It's of those three options, I would prefer CCS by far. If you want to follow us, you can't read that well here. I don't know if the publications will be, or the presentations will be put online, but follow us at both our in English, Bologna_EU on Twitter, or Bologna_NO in Norwegian. There it's a mix of opposition to oil and gas, pro CCS, pro electric cars, and lots of other stuff that's going on in Norway and Europe in the environment and climate debate. Thank you for listening.
All right, I think we're ready to wrap up and continue with the last part of our seminar today, which is a sort of open question panel discussion sort of event. Please feel free to ask questions to a specific person, or just a general question which someone might want to answer. Is there anyone in the audience who'd like to kick us off?
Hi everybody, I'm Valentin. Thank you for the nice presentations today from all of you. My question, you were talking about basically the price to produce CO2 is too low in Europe, right? And you were talking maybe about having a CO2 tax to make it more expensive. But when you see what's happening all over Europe with the Gilets jaunes in France, or the Yellow Vest, sorry, or what you see also happening in Switzerland, when they refuse to have these CO2 tax, so what alternative do you think we can propose, government and the public, to actually increase the price of CO2?
Asbjørn?
Yeah, maybe I can start on that one. Yeah, you're right that CO2 tax, or increasing the CO2 tax actually, because as we mentioned, presently there's 23 euros a ton CO2 in the emissions trading system in Europe. But we need to get up a much higher level in order to make CCS interesting. And as you can see, as you may mention some examples, there are resistance towards this from maybe some groups and maybe many more groups if this should increase. In my mind, this also means that we need to follow up other tracks of doing this. And I did mention some other alternatives. I want to mention then that for instance, being in Norway, the government sector of Norway in national level, local level, is purchasing services and products, investments and so on, for some 500 billion Norwegian kroner a year. So what Norway could do, or the government sector in Norway could do, to say that we will only buy products, services, being, for instance, cement or steel, that is either low carbon, or you have to show that you have handled the CO2 through linking this to CCS. Because then we will put, the effect of this is twofold. You will then put a kind of constraint on the market, because if you want to participate in this game, you need to follow up this. And secondly, since the government sector is so large, then this will also influence, or at least may influence the whole market. For instance, on cement and some other commodities. So this is a way of doing it, not without necessarily having a very high CO2 tax. And there are other alternatives.
I think Olav had a comment.
Yeah, another way is to actually use the income from the sales, because of the in the auctions of the emissions allowances. Norway also gets income from selling these allowances under the EU emissions trading system, but Norway doesn't do what the EU does, because Norway just put this income into the general state budget, whereas in the European Union, a large proportion of these funds are actually put into this what you refer to the innovation fund, which is meant to fund building of CCS or of renewable energy or other. So it funds. It's not only that polluter pays, but the income from these payments or these fees are used to actually reduce emissions. And for me, it's meaningless that Norway does not want to use this, because this has been used to reduce NOx, NOx, nitrous oxides, with success in Norway 4. And this should be used, should be done for CO2 from industry as well. That's one example. Another is what they have done in the United States, whereas it was adopted 1 year ago, that industry that captures and stores CO2 can get a $50 tax reduction for each ton of CO2 that they capture and store. And that's another way of that this sort of cost. You can say it's a cost of lost tax income for the state, or for the national state, for the federal state, or for the regions. But it sort of takes it makes it less visible, and it gives the industry a direct incentive to capture and store the CO2.
Just out of interest, since you know about European policy and so on, I can keep the question with you. I'm curious. Would you be able to answer how things really are different in terms of with respect to CCS in Norway compared to countries that are a part of the EU? Is there much more regulation? Like, how free are countries to work on their own CCS projects within the EU as compared to Norway, which is, of course, outside the EU and has probably a different
Yeah.
way of driving policy.
There has been legislation in Germany where it's been allowed to, the states have been allowed to instate regulation which says that it's illegal to store CO2 in a particular state in Germany. So that's there are some limitations in that case, but in general it's not really on legislation or that's the limitation. I would say it's a lack of interest, lack of sense of urgency. And lack of willingness, both from politicians but also from industry, to look at CCS. There are some industries, European associations, federations of industries, for example in cement, that are increasingly looking into CCS as a solution, and also industries in Sweden, where they have now done what Norway did several years ago, to create roadmaps for what the Swedes call fossil-free or zero-emission industries. And several of these roadmaps are including carbon capture and storage. So it's getting better, slowly.
Any questions? Yes, we have a gentleman up here.
Hello. Yeah, I have a question mostly directed to Egil. I wanted to ask if the Norwegian government is looking into ways to reduce the production of carbon dioxide, and if there are any plans going forward with nuclear energy as an alternative.
As far as I know, there are no plans for nuclear energy in Norway. But as you may know, the energy production in Norway is decarbonized as it is today, apart from actually it's a secret power plant up on Snøhvit, but apart from that, and some energy production on the offshore platforms, and apart from that, it's all hydrocarbon based. So the reduction of emissions from energy production has to do with doing this these processes more efficient. Yes.
Thank you.
Egil, while you still have the floor, you said before that the political atmosphere in Norway, that you said that all the political parties essentially are favorable to CO2 storage in Norway.
As long as they are not in the Ministry of Finance.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Well, aside from them,
Any party in that position will.
we'll say no. But the rest, on the whole, favorable. But is that common? I mean, I think we all we know that Norway is quite far ahead in terms of CCS and moving forward with this. Do you know how other countries feel about this? Is there a lot of disparity between political parties in other countries? Is Norway one of the only parties that has, countries which has this kind of unanimity?
I think maybe others in the panel have more detailed knowledge, but in my view, Norway is unique in the sense that all the political parties are really supporting CCS. In other countries, there are political parties that are reluctant or are really against. But there are, and we see in such countries like the Netherlands, where they have been sort of pro-CCS and have had projects which they didn't succeed, but they were studying it very carefully. Now there seems to be sort of it's not clear where they will end. In UK, there has been a positive attitude towards CCS, and there it was budget constraints that has stopped projects. In Germany, there have been great reluctance, but I think we see it is opening up due to the fact that CCS is relevant on bio-CCS and for industry. So it's a very mixed picture, but I think Norway is definitely in the end of the scale, yes.
Elisa?
Yeah, I could just comment a bit more. What I think is very optimistic, if you look to Sweden, when Sweden decide to do something, they do it. And yeah, go Sweden. And when Sweden is saying, okay, we want to do limit our carbon emission, they really move. And we have delegations here. We see a huge interest, and it's from the Stockholm, from the city of Stockholm to Preem to. It's like a huge impact going on there, which is very. I find it very optimistic, and they see the solution that they can store it in Norway.
Yes.
Which is a good solution.
Yeah, because we have very little storage capability in Sweden.
But when Sweden decides to do something, it looks like they have.
It starts happening.
Yeah, something happens. But one more point I want to make is that CCS is for people very hard to understand. We have a challenge to communicate this. I mean, who knows that this is one of the solutions? If you go out here on the Universitetsplassen and ask people, I'm quite sure that most of the people here don't know it. So, which is it's sad because we need to have people on board and people pushing their politicians to take action to say we want this as a solution.
Yeah, if I may add something also on that, I think Norway is unique in this sense. Things are moving, yes, but still quite some differences. But I think basically there are a couple of misconceptions on CCS, which we maybe have overcome more in Norway, but still you'll find a lot of in European countries. And that is that we really don't need CCS. We can do the climate targets without CCS, which we have tried to show. I think many talked about today that is not really true. It's not realistic that we can do it. And the second one, and related to that, as we also talked about, is that CCS at first was so much linked to fossil fuels, coal-fired power stations. And of course, then you got a reaction from the environmental NGOs, you got it from the green parties in Europe and so on, saying that, well, this is just one more, tactics from the fossil industry to prolong the industry. They do understand that this is not good for climate, but they try the best to prolong the fossil era. Whereas we do know now that that is not really a realistic take on the situation, because we need both to reduce the emission from power sector, but not the least, we have all these industries that emit a lot of CO2, and as we talked about, there's hardly any way, at least available in technology terms, that can handle this without CCS. So and also, it's easy to be in Norway and talk about, well, we have a power sector without CO2 and we don't need CCS. But think about China, think about India. They have a lot of natural resources of coal. Do you really think that I will leave everything in the ground for the benefit of the climate? I don't think so. So we need to have something to offer them too. So this can be combined, at least in a transition phase, with stricter climate policies.
Question from the audience, yes?
I'm Erika. I work in the Department of Chemistry. Thank you for a great symposium. So we heard that the amine-based carbon capture, stopping to capture at the moment, the amine base is one of the most promising technologies. So I'm wondering, what's the current cost of capturing 1 ton of CO2 with the amine technology, considering also the life cycle aspects of it, such as the production of amines and eventually the offsets of byproducts in the process? And are those costs also accounted when we do this economical reasoning in CO2 captured per emissions?
Who wants to do that?
I don't. Well, the question was on the cost of capturing with amines, but also you're talking about environmental costs, or what?
So what I like to hear is whether there is also an assessment of life cycle, of a full perspective of what it costs to capture 1 ton of CO2 using the most current technology. So I take the amine as a reference, and I think this could be a question for Olaf or for Kari.
I think I'm not a technological expert nor an economist, but there's a huge difference in cost for a bit for different technologies. I mean, amines is maybe the ones that's been most used today, and that is it's known. I mean, we can apply it more or less today, whereas others, the ones I mentioned up on the screen, oxy-fuel combustions. Other are membrane technologies where you sort of filter the CO2 in a different way. Which have, in many cases, lower cost estimates, but that have less developed. You can't just buy them in a commercial market easily today. So that's very difficult to estimate. And even for cement plants are different and will have different costs of installing and running the capture plants. And then, of course, if you buy life cycle, you also mean sort of transporting and storing CO2 and monitoring this. Of course, then that's another discussion. But I think the monitoring costs are not going to be the biggest, because the CO2 becomes, I don't know if this has been discussed already, but the CO2 becomes more stable as time passes.
Thank you for the answer. So overall, I have the feeling that the economical perspective of the solution is not very fixed. So since many capturing technology are not yet mature and they are not yet readily available, how can we then project our future? Like Kari Lee was showing, there's a pyramid of future-oriented solution going from proving the technology to having the industry to implement it. But currently we don't know how much it costs. Am I right, or did I misunderstood?
Yes, you're right, because there's quite some uncertainty with regard to the cost of doing CCS. One thing is the captured technologies, but I think it's more actually on how far you can develop these technologies, the kind of learning, and when you scale up deployment. Of course, there is some cost reduction potential doing these technologies, economy of scale, etc. But on the other hand, we also know that there are fiscal limits here, because you have the energy penalty. You have to capture these the CO2. So there are limits to that. So I think the biggest potential here is on you can learn something from doing this, and it's building or large-scale deployment, where you also can cover more of the infrastructure cost, because you have to invest in pipelines, etc., and quite expensive facilities. So if you can share out that on more tons of CO2, you can reduce the cost. So a huge part of this is capital cost or investment cost. In terms of the life cycle, I think there's actually, as you kind of defined it, that broad. I think we don't know too much about that. There are certainly additional costs, but I really haven't seen much numbers on those.
I'd like to see those numbers before we try to push the society into accepting more this technology from capture to storage. I think the cost should be a little bit more transparent. So I hope this will bring more information into the discussion.
Can I make a short comment on this? And
Please do.
if you look at the figures I showed you for the full-scale project we are planning now, with the 5 years production period, if you do the numbers, you will find that you have an abatement cost of in the range 5,000 kroner per ton or something. But if you say that, okay, the technical lifetime of the project are maybe 25 years, and that's probably conservative. If you fill up the storage with more volumes, utilizing the economics of scale, then you might come down to less than 1,000, maybe down to 500. So that's in that range, under 1,000 at least. And this is for the first chain. I think this gives an illustration that we have a starting point that can lead us to figures that are interesting in the sense that you have to do many projects, so you can move down the cost curve and up the learning curve, and then you can, and that is a mean case, and we know that there are other technologies in the pipeline that might have bigger potential than the amines. So I think my point is that we have to do this to demonstrate and see what the potential of the technology is. And then in 2030, we can decide if we have to do this in a small scale or in the big scale. But we, as I said, we have to have it in the toolbox, and we have to start. Sounds like a preacher. Yeah.
Very good, very good, Egil. Very good.
You know what I mean.
Thank you. I was a little surprised that everybody at the panel was so satisfied with Norwegian parties, that everybody was so pro CCS, because I've been trying to follow this arena for some years, and I really see no progress at all. I mean, you had Mongstad, and then it was a setback, and still people think that CCS is Mongstad, and politicians also seem to think that, and that we don't have the technology. But what I learn from scientists here is that we have the technology, and why don't we just start? Why do we have to wait for it to be interesting for the other countries? Wouldn't starting with the 2 projects we have here, and there were more projects that were in line to be proposed, then we could do the Norwegian job, and we would still have the storage, which could take things from the rest of Europe. Why do we have to wait for the others?
We'll go from right to left. Why don't you start?
Yeah, I kind of share your feeling that definitely there's some reluctance among Norwegian politicians. Of course, after the failed moon landing at Mongstad, and it's been difficult, to get maybe sufficient money, Norwegian government money into this. But in a sense, you can say that this is not too surprising, because if Norway goes heavy into this and spend a lot of government money on this, there are at least 2-3 risks doing that, because for this to be a good investment, they have to engage or eventually get the other countries to join in on the dugnad. It doesn't help if Norway is doing this alone. It doesn't help for the climate. Well, no, okay. You can say you can remove some of Norwegian emissions, but they are the ones that can be captured from CO2 or CCS is not so big. So, and that will be enormously expensive if Norway is only doing that. Second one is it depends on how strict climate policies will be in the future. If you don't care, if you don't go for the 2 degree or something, why should we do this? Then it's waste of money. And thirdly, of course, there is also the issue of how much public or government money do you have to put into this before you can kind of engage the industry. So it's also about how much money put in, how do you share the risk of going into this. So I think there is some reluctance on that, but so I think you need to do this stepwise. And Norway, it's fine that Norway is willing to lead, but it doesn't make sense if Norway goes too far. Then we take a very big risk here. And that, I think, at least in political terms, that will be difficult.
I think what Asper is saying is that maybe there's a chance that we will fail in meeting the climate challenge, and that we will be heading for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 degrees global warming. And in that case, there will have been no point, sort of with hindsight, to have invested a couple of billion crowns in Norwegian carbon capture and storage. And you're absolutely right that Norwegian politicians are considering the challenge of climate change. Norwegian politicians are not at all up to the task. I think there was some discussion on or agreement that there was a consensus among Norwegian politicians. At least I would, if I say that, I would refer to the comparison with other countries, so that Norway is less bad than other countries, but it's still very bad, because even though you might say CCS is necessary, the question is, will you want to prioritize this when Egil and his ministry are coming with a proposal towards the government and then later to the Norwegian Parliament? So I think that's That is it's both the optimistic take and also the pessimistic take, since Norwegian politicians are just saying that this is good, but we don't want to spend money on it, and we would prefer if someone else does it first, etc. This kind of procrastination and excuses. So I think the Norwegian full-scale project, by investing a couple of well, quite a few billion Norwegian crowns in capture, transport, and storage, and having a storage that allows others to store, you will create a discussion in Europe. Look, it's there. We don't know exact cost. That it refers to your question as well. It's like with electric cars, with batteries, with solar panels. 15, 20 years ago, I think no one would predict where we would be today. But of course, it's the people who started doing this who have today been proven right that this was a good thing to do. And I hope it should be the same with carbon capture and storage as well. But we won't see the sort of reductions in the costs within the first few years, but maybe in 5, 10, 15 years.
I think we'll have to.
First of all, there are several hundred people working with the Norwegian full-scale project today in Equinor, in Total, in Shell, in Norcem, in Fortum, in Aker, in Cansolv, in Gasnova, and even some in the ministry. So hundreds of people are actually working. So we are progressing this project as fast as we can at present. But when it comes to why shouldn't we just rush along? Actually, we are rushing along. But when we come to the investment decision, it is a very important point that this is relevant for the others, because that has not only to do with the financing of the project, but this has to, if Europe is involved and take care about the project, then we are able to spread the experience better, so we can get the snowballs rolling. So that is an important element in this. We have this project for Norwegian emissions. I will not say it's irrelevant, but if it stops there, this is the most costly thing you can do in Norway. There are, maybe apart from electrical vehicles, sorry for that. But there are other measures that are more efficient in Norway in that time span we are talking about. So the whole idea is that this shall bring others along, that we shall spread the technology, that they say use the experience from the Norwegian project and use the excess capacity in the Norwegian project.
All right,
One more question.
one more question. All right, I think we'll make this maybe the last one.
Hi, my name is Berta, and I'm a master student here. And I have a question for Kari. Yeah. And by the way, I'm also one of a big fan of the Swedish girl there. I think she's very brave and consistent. Yeah. And so my question is, when you do the CO2 storage, do you use existing oil and gas wells, or do you drill a new formation to store the CO2 here? And secondly, if you do use the old oil and gas wells, so why is CO2 perceived negative or less popular compared to other renewable energy? That's all. Thank you.
In the full-scale project, we're not reusing any all the oil and gas wells. There will be a new well drilled through the sequence, and this is because we are injecting into a dry, or it's a water-filled aquifer, water-filled sand. So of course we could use old oil fields because those have proven cap rocks, which would be a very a good way to reuse old oil fields, but that's not in the plan right now. But that's part of the potential on our continental shelf. Okay.
All right, I think we're going to wrap up here. Thank you so much again, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much to our speakers. We have a small token of our appreciation, since we are speaking about CO2 storage here. We have, in each of your names, removed 1 ton of CO2 by planting trees. So we have one of those for each of you. We also have
Thank you.
some rocks.
Thank you, tack.
Morning.
Tack.
Allez.
Tusen tack.
Tack.
Tack så jättemycket för att du kom.
Tack. Fantastic.
Jättemycket.
Tack så mycket.
Tack.